Welcome to Crime Story. Today, I bring you a chilling and haunting tale, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Operating under the cover of darkness, he terrorized California for over a year, taking 13 lives and leaving countless others scarred by his brutality. His reign of terror became infamous, and the media dubbed him the Night Stalker. This is the story of his rise, his twisted crimes, and his eventual capture. If you find this story gripping, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to support us in bringing you more fascinating crime stories. Let's dive into the story. Los Angeles, 1985. The city that never slept had become a city that never felt safe. Something dark lurked in the night, something unseen but ever present. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, fear crept into the hearts of Californians. No one knew when or where he would strike next, only that he would. The attacks began suddenly, without warning. Homes once considered sanctuaries became crime scenes. Victims ranged from young professionals to elderly couples, each targeted at random. There was no pattern, no clear motive. Doors were left broken, windows shattered. On walls and mirrors, eerie symbols were sometimes scrawled, cryptic messages that only added to the terror. It wasn't long before the media gave him a name, the Night Stalker. A faceless predator, lurking in the darkness, choosing his victims without logic or mercy. People locked their doors, reinforced their windows, and purchased weapons, but none of it felt like enough. He moved silently, striking like a ghost before vanishing back into the shadows. The fear spread like wildfire. Whispers of his attacks echoed in workplaces, schools, and homes. No one felt safe, not the rich, not the poor, not even those who slept with a gun under their pillow. This was no ordinary criminal. This was something else. And the worst part? The Night Stalker was just getting started. El Paso, Texas, 1960s. A city bathed in the relentless heat of the desert, where a young boy named Richard Ramirez was growing up in a household that offered no warmth. His father, a strict and temperamental man, had a short fuse, and when that fuse burned out, Richard was often on the receiving end of his rage. The walls of their home absorbed the echoes of shouted words and the sharp sound of discipline gone too far. There was no refuge, no safe place where he could escape the storm brewing within his own family. As if the physical punishments weren't enough, Richard suffered 2 severe head injuries as a child. One left him unconscious, the other led to seizures that would follow him into adolescence. The world around him became unpredictable, sometimes too loud, sometimes eerily silent. He was different, and he knew it. But if life at home had been difficult, what came next would shape him into something else entirely. In his search for an escape, Richard turned to his older cousin, Miguel, a former soldier who had served in Vietnam. Miguel was charismatic, fearless, and to a boy like Richard, someone to admire. But admiration turned into something much darker. Miguel didn't tell war stories, he relived them. He showed Richard gruesome photos from the battlefield, snapshots of suffering frozen in time. Severed heads, tortured bodies, images meant to haunt the mind. But to Miguel, they were trophies. To Richard, they became lessons. Then came the moment that changed everything. One night, in a heated argument, Miguel pulled out a gun and shot his wife in the head right in front of 13-year-old Richard. Blood pooled at his feet, the smell of gunpowder filled the air, and something inside him shifted. The boy who had once been scared, weak, and powerless now saw violence not as something to fear, but as something to wield. And from that moment on, Richard Ramirez would never be the same. June 28, 1984. The city of Los Angeles had no idea that this night would mark the beginning of a reign of terror that would last over a year. Jenny Vincao, a 79-year-old woman, was found dead in her home. The crime scene was brutal. Her apartment had been ransacked, signs of forced entry were evident, and what was once a peaceful home had turned into a scene of horror. It wasn't just a robbery. This was something else. The brutality suggested a deeper, more sinister motive, one that law enforcement had yet to understand. For months, there was silence. Then, on March 17, 1985, the terror resurfaced. That night, Maria Hernandez walked into her garage, unaware that a shadow was waiting. A gunshot rang out, but by sheer luck, the bullet deflected off her car keys, sparing her life. She ran, desperate, her heart pounding. But inside the house, her roommate Dale Okazaki wasn't as fortunate. A second shot was fired, and this time, there was no escaping it. As if the night wasn't already drenched in blood, the killer wasn't done. Just hours later, Tsai Yu, a young woman driving home, became his next target. She never saw it coming. The randomness of the attack sent a wave of fear through the city. There was no clear pattern, no specific type of victim. He chose at will, struck at random, and disappeared into the night like a ghost. Days later, the violence escalated further. Vincent Zazara, 64, and his wife, Maxine, 44, were murdered in their home. This time, it wasn't just a shooting. The scene was more gruesome, the level of violence more personal. A disturbing realization dawned upon investigators: this killer wasn't just murdering, he was evolving. Each crime was more ruthless than the last. He wasn't just taking lives. He was enjoying it. The city was gripped by fear. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and the surrounding communities became battlegrounds of paranoia. Gun stores saw lines stretching around the block as terrified residents armed themselves, hoping to stand a chance if the killer ever chose their home. Security companies struggled to keep up with demand. Deadbolts, alarm systems, and reinforced doors were being installed at record speed. But deep down, everyone knew the truth: if the Night Stalker wanted in, he would find a way. What made him even more terrifying was his unpredictability. There was no pattern, no consistency. He targeted the young and the elderly, men and women alike. Race, social class, and location didn't matter. He struck wherever he pleased. He could be anywhere, and that was what terrified people the most. No one knew who was next. The only thing they knew was that when night fell, he could be lurking outside. At several crime scenes, investigators found an unsettling clue: a pentagram drawn on walls, mirrors, or even left behind on the victims themselves. Some whispered of satanic rituals, others believed it was a twisted message, a sign of something even darker than simple murder. The press latched onto the theory, spreading the hysteria further. Was this just one man, or was something more sinister at play? With each new attack, the pressure mounted. The FBI formed a special task force, pooling resources from across the state. Every detective, forensic expert, and profiler was put to work, piecing together the nightmare one clue at a time. But the Night Stalker was a ghost, one who vanished as easily as he struck. While California lived in fear, Ramirez thrived in the chaos, feeding off the terror he created. And worst of all, he was far from finished. It was a breakthrough that came from the most unexpected place. A witness, who had been at the scene of one of Richard Ramirez's many brutal attacks, provided a crucial detail: a partial license plate number. It was a small lead, but it was enough to send investigators scrambling to track it down. At first, it seemed like just another dead end, but soon after, anonymous tips began pouring in, pointing to a man named Richard Ramirez. The name rang a bell, but it was so common that it seemed almost impossible to pin down. Who was this man, and could he truly be the terror that had swept across California? Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. But then, the breakthrough came. A search through old records revealed that Ramirez had been arrested for theft back in 1960, and crucially, his fingerprints were on file. The match was undeniable. The man terrorizing California wasn't some random figure, but someone who had already been in the system. Now, With this critical evidence, the police began to close in on him. The next step was to get his face out there. A composite sketch was quickly created, based on descriptions from surviving victims, and it was plastered across every newspaper in Southern California. For the first time, the killer's face was no longer just an enigma. It was everywhere. Ramirez was no longer invisible. His identity was known, and the walls were closing in. The Night Stalker was about to be caught. August 1985. Richard Ramirez, having no idea that his reign of terror was about to end, found himself back in Los Angeles. For over a year, he had been the shadow that haunted every dark corner of California. Now, as he walked the streets of the city he once terrorized, he was still unaware that his face had become synonymous with fear. But that night, everything changed. Ramirez entered a convenience store, likely thinking it was just another normal stop. But as he approached the counter, his eyes landed on something that made his heart race: a newspaper headline with his face plastered on the front cover. It was the first time he saw the image of the Night Stalker staring back at him. In that moment, reality hit. His face was everywhere, and the entire city was looking for him. But it was too late to run. As Ramirez exited the store, a group of bystanders immediately recognized him. Panic spread quickly through the crowd as whispers turned into shouts. The next few moments would be a blur for him. People pointed at him, alerted the authorities, and within seconds, the chase was on. 7 police cars and a helicopter followed him through the chaotic streets of Los Angeles. But he wasn't going to escape this time. Exhausted and cornered, Ramirez was surrounded by a crowd of civilians. The rage that had built up over months of fear boiled over as they dragged him to the ground, beating him with metal rods and fists. He fought back weakly, but it was no use. The mob had control, and by the time the police arrived, it was clear, Ramirez had been caught by the very people he had terrorized. When the officers pulled him to safety, something unexpected happened. Ramirez thanked them. Perhaps he realized, for the first time, that the very citizens he had scarred had just saved him from a far worse fate, the wrath of the mob. In an instant, his days as the Night Stalker were over. In 1989, the courtroom was filled with a tense energy as one of the most sensational trials in California history began. Richard Ramirez, now a notorious figure, stood in front of a judge wearing dark sunglasses, his face expressionless. As the charges were read: 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, he didn't flinch. His smirk, however, was unmistakable. There was no remorse in his eyes, no sign that he understood the gravity of his actions. To him, the trial seemed like just another stage, another moment where he could manipulate the situation. The verdict came swiftly: guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 13 death penalties, 1 for each victim he had mercilessly taken. But even as the gavel fell, the closure many sought was still far off. Justice was delayed. Ramirez, ever the manipulator, filed a series of appeals, dragging the legal process on for years. What should have been a straightforward execution became a drawn-out saga. Despite his horrendous crimes, Ramirez gained a surprising cult following. Women, enamored by his dark persona, began writing him letters in prison. One even went so far as to marry him while he was incarcerated, claiming that he was kind, funny, and misunderstood. To the outside world, it was an absurd reality, but for Ramirez, it was just another form of control. He thrived on attention, no matter the source. Yet, in 2013, after spending 23 years on death row, Ramirez's fate was sealed not by the legal system, but by B-cell lymphoma. The man who had caused so much pain and fear died quietly in prison, never facing the execution he so rightfully deserved. His death was a grim reminder that the justice system doesn't always provide the closure victims' families deserve. The legacy of his crimes, his lack of remorse, and the bizarre following he garnered remained a chilling chapter in the history of American criminal justice. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a killer, he was a master manipulator, a predator who thrived on fear. His victims were not merely targets of violence, they were victims of his desire for control, his need to dominate and instill terror. His crimes went beyond the physical acts of murder and assault, they were about breaking the will of others, bending them to his sick whims, and leaving a trail of fear that would haunt the communities he terrorized. Every attack, every home invasion, was a way for him to assert his power, a twisted game he played with the lives of others. The legacy of the Night Stalker is one that reminds us that evil doesn't always look like a monster lurking in the shadows. It can wear the face of someone who blends in with society, someone who moves through life unnoticed, hiding in plain sight. For over a year, Ramirez walked among us, and it wasn't until he was finally caught that the world truly understood the depths of his depravity. But even with his capture and death, the legacy of his terror remains etched in the minds of those who survived, and those who lost loved ones. As we close the chapter on this dark tale, we're left with a chilling truth: justice may have caught up to him, but some scars never fade. Final call to action. If you found this story chilling, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. Stay safe. Stay vigilant.